Secret Society is among the programmes under review in Did You See on Saturday at 10:20. And in next week's programme, Duncan Campbell looks at the government's emergency laws and the contents of the draft Emergency Powers Bill for use in time of crisis. That's next Wednesday at 10:20.
It's more than 20 years since NATO planners decided that any future conflict could not be an all-or-nothing nuclear war over in a few hours. So the new NATO strategy has made the extensive use of civil resources vital to military mobilization. But Whitehall's opted not to discuss the implications. In secret, though, they've agreed dozens of plans for resources to be allocated to meet the US requirement.
Absolutely critical. There is no question, but it is one of the major wartime tasks of the United Kingdom is to be ready to receive massive amounts of material and personnel and to move them efficiently into the combat zone.
The US Air Force itself, in official evacuation plans for US bases in Britain, says,
"Here in England, we're in the front lines where the action is."
The last time Britain was in the front lines was September 1939.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note.
Shortly before war was declared, a secretly written Emergency Powers Act was suddenly produced by the government and rushed through Parliament. It gave the government authority to take over any resources it needed, conscript labour and imprison people it regarded as dangerous. There was no time for Parliament to scrutinise the terms of the new laws.
That no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
A few months into the war, the new laws were found to be too severe, so Parliament quickly reduced the government's special powers. The new laws are only partly based on what happened last time.
Well, it seems as though a lot of the basic provisions are obviously similar and draw on experience from the Second World War. But in many cases, they seem to go a lot further and envisage much more sweeping powers for the government, particularly in a time of real crisis, of going far beyond powers that were taken in the 1940s.
Just as in the 40s, thousands of American troops would be coming to Britain, but much more quickly, needing more from us. 15 years ago, secret negotiations began on the Americans' requests.
Total commitment. In other words, for every plan we made to reinforce and resupply, there had to be host facilities to receive the material, transship it, secure it, protect it, so that it was expected that every host nation was going to meet all of those requirements fully and promptly.
That sort of requirement can't be met without new legal powers. So at the Home Office, special official committees on home defence have recently been supervising the preparation of the new war laws.
In the last 6 years or so, this government has embarked on a sort of major programme of rejigging the whole process and has produced a whole series of new bills with new powers and in different orders and so on, so that the whole system has been modernised and brought up to date.
On the 15th of October 1983, this senior civil servant was given a special assignment in the Home Office. Last year, Peter Harvey finished writing regulations to implement the new emergency laws. But Parliament isn't allowed to know. When MP Archie Kirkwood asked about Mr. Harvey's work, all the Home Secretary would say was that,
"I do not think it is helpful to discuss the contribution of individual officers."
So we checked the Home Office's internal directory, which MPs aren't allowed to have. Mr. Harvey's there as a legal consultant performing special duties with F6 Division. That division's only legal job is war emergency legislation. Number 10 have been equally reticent. The Prime Minister's refused to admit that any draft emergency laws existed, let alone newly written bills.
It will be for the government and Parliament of the day to determine the content and introduction of any such measures. It is not a matter which Parliament need address now.
But why should the government want to conceal the new laws from MPs?
Well, I think they might be somewhat surprised at the degree of power that the government proposes to take, even quite early on in a crisis.
Widespread anti-nuclear protests have made war planning a sensitive subject round Whitehall. But we've talked to officials who've seen the new bills. They're already printed and could go to Parliament tomorrow. Today, they're stamped secret. There's going to be 3 bills, the first one to be passed very early in a crisis. It includes controls on public order, selective arrest and internment. Members of some army units have already been trained to run internment camps.
It did actually quite shock me to quite a large extent, because I'd never ever realised that was the type of thing that the TA was going to be used for.
One type of internment camp was to hold suspected saboteurs. An island on the south coast had quite another role.
This was a different type of internment camp. It was more for a mass of people, not for individuals.
What kind of British people were supposedly being picked up in this exercise?
Obviously people such as pacifists, politicos, etc. were major targets. They were people that would be singled out for special treatment.
Were you under any doubt that this was a dry run for the internment of British civilians?
Absolutely no doubt about it at all. That's what shocked me about it.
A full list of designated essential service routes is posted outside your local authority headquarters.
The first two new emergency powers bills provide for controls on transport and movement by the public, at a time when many people could desperately be trying to move to areas they thought safer. The laws are intended to control not just panic, but dissent as well.
We're trying to get across to relatives in Lincolnshire.
Not this way, you're not. Essential services only this road. You'll have to find another route, I'm afraid.
Well, that's bloody ridiculous. You can't just stop people like that.
Essential service routes include major trunk roads through almost every British city. The name's recently changed, and now it's just effective traffic management. The government may not close roads completely, but police are still told to keep refugees off.
If that were you, I'd go home and sit tight. That's what they're advising people to do.
Fred's is fiction, but plans to keep motorways free for priority military operations are fact. Much of the urban population had been penned in and forced to stay put, with little hope of escape. One important escape route from the city of Glasgow leads north to the banks of Loch Lomond. But there's something about these famous banks that make this an area affected by yet another aspect of the secret new laws.
As I walk down Loch Lomond side on a fine spring morning.
It's a tourist high spot, but tourists don't expect to find what's hidden in the hills.
It came on without warning. I Glen Douglas then, I trampled west across the hills to reach Loch Long, and it put my mettle to the test, and in my heart a joyful song. But before my eyes the scene had changed. Man-made structures flanked the hills, caverns grim of concrete grey, and rose so menacing and still. I wondered what these things could be. No reason for them could I find. A change of mood come over me that day upon the road.
Emergency powers, stage 1. All the land you've seen would be designated as ground defence areas.
The whole areas around military bases, airfields and so on would almost be put under military control, in which they'd be able to clear areas in order to defend them. And these could extend for some miles around the bases, in which the people living in the area will effectively be under military control. If a house was in the way of a line of fire or something in defending the base, then it would be pulled down.
For the first time last year, the government admitted its plans for ground defence areas, GDAs. They would be
the area associated with the tactical plan for defending a base. Each vital installation has an individual GDA tailored to its needs and the local geography.
But who'll take charge in these special areas? In a crisis, boundaries between police and military responsibilities could get a little blurred. Should they be controlled by civil police or soldiers? If so, British or American? Officially, British laws and British police are in sole charge at all times. They should normally enforce the emergency laws. That's called the primacy of the police. But would this concept really work?
Obviously, the military are going to have sweeping powers to do more or less as they want to do, and that's going to be seen as the main priority. And peacetime legal constraints, I think, are probably going to take second place. Although the Americans are subject to British law, they're actually tried by American courts, so to some extent they are outside the British legal system.
This convoy's carrying British nuclear weapons. But during protests at the American nuclear store at Greenham Common, a ring of British troops and police were used to keep American forces and British protesters apart. But in a real crisis, would protesters be handled so gently?
I think it would be total resistance, total demand on the British government that any interference be suppressed immediately and completely.
If there were such a resistance and the United Kingdom police could not cope?
I'm sure that they would call upon the U.S. forces to assist in the maintenance of order and security around our military bases and in our logistics support facilities.
I think if, in fact, that the protests got to the point of where there was actually insurrection or actual violence between the NATO military forces and the local population, then clearly American military commanders have the authority to use deadly force in the protection of their military assets.
I would have thought under these conditions, something approaching martial law would have to take place, and the police are certainly not equipped for that.
How would the dispute as to the use of resources between US military requirements and British civilian requirements be resolved in this extreme crisis situation?
But the way they're always resolved, actually. I mean, the civilian requirements would come second. I think that's obviously...
Always?
Well, it did last time. I don't see why this should change.
The English lakes were one of the venues for a mock mobilization exercise 5 months ago. The exercise tested the emergency laws for the first time. Thousands of refugees fled from Liverpool to the lakes, tramping for miles in the hope of finding food and shelter in Cumbria. But with the lakeland tourist industry closed down for winter, there wouldn't be food reserves to support hordes of unwelcome incomers, and that had caused public order problems, to say the least. Thousands of US troops poured into Manchester Airport and Liverpool docks. These became enemy targets and were heavily bombed. So the exercise anticipated that stage 2 of emergency powers had been reached. Civilian planes, like shipping and surface transport, would all be directed from a secret national coordination center. During the exercise, a special government regional emergency committee was set up in this government office block in Manchester. For 2 days in November, this was a mini Whitehall ruling the whole of northwestern England. The exercise was only on paper, but there's nothing fictional about the scale of US reinforcements.
Something in the order of 75,000 troops moving in the first few days of a combat situation in Europe.
And how many coming later?
As we mobilize the reserves, we're talking about another 200,000, 300,000, 400,000.
Well, I think if most of the British troops go to Europe as currently planned, there would actually be more American troops in Britain than British troops.
It would